Welcome to your Daily 5 for Wednesday, September 6th, 2023. As I think I've mentioned on more than one occasion, I am a member of the Club Chwit Premium membership or subscription, whatever you want to call it, for the Chwit.tv shows, which essentially is an ad-free version of those shows, and there's some stuff that they do behind the scenes for Club Chwit members exclusively. And one of those things is a book club, which is usually comes from suggestions, or at least traditionally up till now, has come from suggestions from Stacey Higginbotham, who is, or was up until very recently, one of the co-hosts of This Week in Google. And while she is no longer podcasting right now because she's taken a new job, she is still doing the book club, at least for this foreseeable future. And the book that had won the vote for the event that was held last week is called Translation State by Ann Leckie, I believe is how it's supposed to be pronounced. And this is a book, I will read the description just to give a brief synopsis. Description is: the mystery of a missing translator sets 3 lives on a collision course that will have a ripple effect across the stars. Now, that's a very broad explanation, and apparently from what I understand of the discussion and what was said, this is a book that is part of a larger series of books about this universe, but it is not one that requires reading any of those other books, and I have not. I've only read this one. As far as I know, this is the only Ann Leckie book I've ever read. And while there are things in the book that do feel like they probably are fleshed out somewhere else, there are characters where you feel like, oh, I think maybe there's more to this that maybe some people already know. None of it is where, if you haven't read the other books, because again, I haven't, I don't think any of it stops the book from being enjoyable on its own. I think it works fine as an independent work. It's just that there's some details that you might be missing out on. I guess, as I said, haven't read them, so I don't know. I never felt lost in this book in terms of the narrative, the who people were, what they were doing, the universe at large. I never felt like any of that was missing. I was fine with that. Where you might get tripped up a bit in the beginning is this is a book that is largely about identity. And so there are identities and pronouns and descriptions that are made up in the book that sometimes veer very close in their spelling to normal English words for pronouns, descriptions, that type of thing. So for a while, I wasn't sure if my Kindle book was actually mistranslated, because that does happen with Kindle. You'll get books that have misspellings or things that are strangely spaced. And then after a while, I kind of figured it out. But it can be a little bit of there's a little bit of confusion sometimes in the beginning. But if you can get through that, you'll figure it out, and then it becomes a standard that you can go with for the rest of the book. I don't think it's terrible. I'm just saying, just be aware there might be a little bit of that kind of narrative confusion up front. Now, this is a book, I've described many movies that I talk about as 50-50 movies, where there's as much good as there is bad. And this book is somewhat like that, in that the beginning quarter of it, or 25-30%, or maybe 15 to 20%, is good. The setup is good. The way everything that's happening is laid out, I think, is done very well. You get a mystery right off the bat. You kind of get some family dynamics, a character who's struggling with something that's just happened, a major trauma in their life. And that's all really good. And then once the character gets into, I guess, space or wherever they go, and starts their investigation, things slow down and get a little bit muddled for a while. So the middle of this book, there were a couple of times where I wasn't sure if I was going to finish it. But I thought, no, stick with it. I want to see this thing through. I don't like stopping books. The same way I don't really like stopping movies unless I feel like they're actually actively being cruel or insulting me or something like that. And it's rare when that happens. This book came nowhere near that. But the middle does drag a bit, I'll just warn you. But then, once you get to the ending, there's a point in the ending, a courtroom scene, or basically what is the equivalent of a courtroom scene, where there's an event that happens and the book takes off. And at that point, it's off and running. And I thought it was excellent from there on out. And honestly, if you're going to have a book that's not consistent all the way through, I mean, that's the ideal, is to have a consistently great book. But if you can't do that, if you can stick the beginning and the end, I'm going to forgive all the stuff, and that will overcome all the problems in the middle. And that's definitely the case here. So once I got to the end and finished the book, I actually found that I enjoyed it quite a bit. I'll just warn you that the middle does sag here and there. It will get slow. You may have some problems with it. But I would say stick with it. I think, and read the longer synopsis. I'm not going to read a 4-page synopsis, but read the longer description that I'll link to here. And if it sounds at all interesting, try it out, read it, because I think it is worth it in the end. I'm not going to say it's a great book, but I had a good time with it. I found it was interesting. And I think most people, if you stick it out to the end, will probably come to the same place. Like I said, if the premise sounds interesting. Because, again, opening setup, while confusing at times, is really good, and the ending is dynamite. So again, it's called Translation State by Ann Leckie, and I would say read it, because I had a good time with it. Later.